High above, the cottonwood leaves rattle like bones in the night wind. Somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove calls, but there is no reply. The tiny hairs at the nape of your neck stand on end and goose flesh sprouts across your skin. It's colder now, and there is something unsettling about the way sobbing cries seem to haunt the water's edge. You suddenly realize that you are no longer alone. But who is this ethereal woman, and for what purpose does she cry? What could have happened to someone of such beauty to transform them into this pitiful visage of melancholy? And why do you get the overwhelming sense that you shouldn't draw near? The depths of a violent and sorrowful history may hold the answers to all your questions, but some things are better left a mystery. The American West is not simply defined nor necessarily constrained by the bounds of space and time, perhaps not even by life and death. It is this colorful combination of interwoven cultures, histories, perspectives, and tragedies that envelops us like a shroud. Long before boots and spurs left their prints upon the dusty trail, empires of obsidian and stone were hewn from the vast prairies and desert wasteland. The peoples of these myriad nations painted the boundless earth with their beliefs and superstitions. When soldiers robed in coats of steel arrived upon the unbroken shore, gleaming in the sunlight from atop mighty steeds, they brought with them their own faiths and fears. In the tide of bloodshed that followed, new cultures were violently born, bringing with them stories that shared characteristics both ancient and new. Throughout the desert Southwest, something stalks the waterways, preying upon the young, the foolish, and the lost. Depending on who you ask and where you are at the time, the details surrounding the origin of this phantom predator will change. Should you ask a Burqueño beneath the cottonwoods at the edge of the Rio Grande, their version will undoubtedly differ from an Arizonan sitting on the banks of the Gila or the Salt. Likewise, yarns of Californios, Tejanos, and Mexicans will proffer varying takes on how La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, came to be. The following tales are simply variations on a central theme as this narrator was first introduced to the subject in question. In a small Mexican village, there once lived a beautiful young woman named Maria. She was a lively and vivacious girl who had the uncanny ability to draw the gaze of every man she passed. The village where Maria lived was nowhere of note, subsisting mostly on meager farmsteads and inconsequential herds of scrawny cattle. While Maria could lay claim to any man in the village she wished, the woman harbored no desire for any of them. It was true that some of the men were charming, even handsome, but there was one thing Maria desired in a partner above all else: wealth. Maria, like everyone else in her village, lived the poverty-stricken life of a peasant, scratching what little they had from the dry soil of the rugged hinterlands. Neither a handsome face nor charming smile would allow her to escape the tiny village and live the life of excitement and luxury she so desired. Then, one day, the son of a nearby ranchero came into town atop a strong, beautiful stallion. He was both handsome and charming, but unlike her own people, his family was quite rich, well known for holding extravagant fiestas to which all of the elite would attend. Maria made it her mission to seduce this man, and once he fell in love with her, she would be free of her indignant existence. By sundown of that day, Maria had the man wrapped around her little finger. Enamored with his new woman, the man showered Maria with gifts. He bought for her elaborate dresses, and together they danced through the night, rubbing elbows with other wealthy rancheros and many notable government officials. Maria loved this man, if not for his heart, at least for the promise that he represented, the escape she longed so desperately for. While the pair mingled with the upper crust of society, Maria often noticed glances and sneers issued forth from jealous girls and snobbish gentry. They knew she was not one of them, but their opinions mattered little to Maria. Even her friends and parents warned against seeing this man. They understood that the two lovers were of different worlds, that glorious endings were simply not in the cards for people of the lower class. Nothing good will come of this, they whispered, never knowing just how right they would be. It wasn't long before Maria became pregnant, giving birth to a baby boy. Afterwards, Maria noticed a marked difference in the frequency of her lover's visits. He no longer rode into town in a gilded carriage to whisk her away for evening festivities. His gifts, too, began to dwindle. Maria begged the man to marry her, to take her away from the dingy village so that they could become a family and live the life she had so far only glimpsed. The man promised her that one day he would marry her, but he could not do so at the moment. He was busy working his father's ranch, saving money so that he could afford to buy her the grandest of weddings. It pained Maria to hear these words, but still she clung to hope that the man would keep his word. Then she gave birth to a second boy, and suddenly the man she so loved disappeared from her life altogether. Left with no other choice, Maria spent all her time tending to her two children. When asked, she claimed to care for her boys very much, but inside her broken heart, resentment had begun to fester. While the other villagers shook their heads behind her back and lamented the awful hand Maria had been dealt, she spent every waking moment subconsciously blaming the children for her dire predicament. Then, much to everyone's surprise, the man returned. His carriage rolled to a stop at the center of the village square, and, like a herald of old, he announced that there would be a marriage ceremony most ostentatious. Not to Maria, mind you, but to another woman, one younger and prettier than Maria, one without the burden of unwanted children. Most importantly, however, she was from another wealthy family, not a peasant like Maria. When the man left town, he did so without even acknowledging Maria. It was like she had never existed at all. At that moment, she realized the other villagers had been right. The wealthy man had never been in love with a filthy peasant girl. Maria had only been a distraction to him, something to use and then toss away like trash. That night, in a fit of rage, she wrapped her children in a burlap sack and pulled them down to the edge of a nearby river. Wading into the freezing water, children screaming and crying, she tossed them into the stream with little hesitation. There was a brief moment of relief as the wails of her children disappeared downstream. Then, with sudden clarity, Maria realized what she had done. She charged through the frigid waters, screaming as she tried to rescue the children she had just condemned. But the current was simply too strong. Her boys were already gone. Stricken by grief, Maria wandered the riverbanks, wailing and sobbing as she searched for the remains of her children. Never stopping to eat or even sleep, Maria slowly wasted away until one day the crying suddenly ceased. Curious villagers found Maria's body sprawled out on the riverbank, a sickly shadow of her former self. Maria had died in the night, killed by her sins and sorrow. When Maria's soul reached the gates of heaven, she was greeted by St. Peter, who scornfully barred the way. The holy man informed Maria of God's judgment, citing her heinous acts of wrath, jealousy, and murder. She begged and pleaded to enter heaven, explaining her plight, that she had been wronged and treated unfairly. Feeling sorry for the woman, Peter offered her a bargain, a task to complete in order to absolve herself of wrongdoing. Maria would be cursed to wander all the rivers of the world until she found the scattered bones of her children and could return them to him. Maria accepted these terms, thinking she would simply snatch the bones from the riverbed near the village and be done with the feat. Much like her dream of wealth, it was simply not to be. Maria's spirit, draped in a gown of white, scoured the stream by her village, but found nothing remaining of her drowned children. It seemed the current had strewn the bones much farther afield than she had originally anticipated. Maria quickly grew frustrated with her failures, her ghostly attire growing ragged and stained. At night, her sobbing cries could be heard by the peasants she had once called neighbors, and they were drawn once again to the mournful calls. It was then that Maria had an idea. She would take the bones of those who wandered the river at night, be them lost or imprudent, gathering enough to trick St. Peter into allowing her through the gates. As wayward travelers and irresponsible village children began to disappear, the name of Maria was forgotten and transformed into the frightful moniker La Llorona, the Weeping Woman. Despite her clever villainy, La Llorona was never able to deceive St. Peter with the skeletons of her many victims. As a consequence of her continued treachery, she was forsaken from the light of grace and bound to the rivers till the end of days. It is there, along the streams and waterways, that she still wanders, searching for bones. Despite the horrific mutation from pitiful spirit to vengeful revenant, it seems that La Llorona has not entirely lost the humanity she once possessed. There once was a lowly woodcutter who lived in a village on the banks of the Rio Hondo. The small farming community was much like that of Maria's youth, populated by the Mexican descendants of conquering Spain. The woodcutter, however, was a man of full-blooded indigenous descent, and the last of his kind. Due to his heritage, the woodcutter was relegated to the fringes of society and looked down upon by the Mexicans and purebred Spanish. As such, the only way for him to earn money was by collecting and selling the firewood he found beside the river. After years spent gathering sticks and branches on the near side of the river, the woodcutter had nearly picked his stockpile clean. This left him no other choice but to wade across the Rio Hondo, where his particular crop existed in abundance. He spent all afternoon piling the wood and wrapping it into a bundle with cords of rope. By the time his work was complete, the sun was already beginning to sink below the western horizon. The cottonwoods cast long shadows across the twilight world as daylight faded into night. With a sigh, the woodcutter hefted his heavy load onto his shoulders and began the trek back toward town. As he neared the shallow ford, he heard a low, almost melodic moan coming from the water. When he reached the sandy riverbank, he was shocked to see an unearthly figure of a tall, beautiful woman standing at the midpoint of the crossing. A glistening mane of jet-black hair ran in silken lengths from crown to curve of her back. She was draped in a thin white gown, soaked to the bone, revealing shades of pale skin in the silvered moonlight. It was evident to him that she had been crying, though there was no clue as to why. There was something about her finely hewn features, though, that deeply reminded the woodcutter of his mother, of his own people that once lived free upon the land before the coming of Spain. Drawing near, the woman suddenly turned, her beauty instantly transformed into a twisted mask of malice and hate. The woodcutter howled in fright at the sudden change. He tried to rush back across the river and away from the terrifying woman, but had grown sluggish from his hefty cargo. Suddenly, he felt dagger-sharp talons rip through his clothes and scrape against his skin, drawing warm blood. The demonic woman spun him around, scattering his wood across the water. In a daze of terror, the woodcutter realized the woman had grown exponentially, now towering above the Rio Hondo, his own body like a doll in the fist of a child. The monster's jaws opened wide, slavering fangs ready to rend him in two. The woodcutter struggled against the iron grip, but could not manage to break free. With each desperate motion, his wounds grew wider, fresh blood soaking his shirt. "Why are you doing this?" he screamed. "What have I done to deserve it?" The giant woman abruptly stopped, binding claws slackening ever so slightly. The woman looked at the woodcutter, a faint memory rising in her mind's eye. The woodcutter's face was familiar to her, not that La Llorona had known him in a past life, but that they had once shared a similar existence. She recognized the native blood running hot over her gnarled fingers. There was a primeval bond shared between the two, despite the vast gulfs of time between them. This man was one of her own kind. The wailing woman dropped the poor woodcutter, belting out a penetrating cry filled with agony and pain. Then, in an instant, the phantom vanished, leaving the man alone in the cold water of the Rio Hondo, the only witness to the terrible occasion. From that day on, the woodcutter made it a habit to leave himself enough time to cross the river before dark. On the rare occasions where he was unable to make the journey in time, he slept beneath the stars beside his cord of wood and awaited the coming of dawn. Though La Llorona has a storied connection to rivers and waterways, on rare occasions she is freed from her aquatic bondage to hunt her quarry. Take, for example, the story of young Michela and La Llorona of the Moon. Most children, as they grow to maturity, reach a place in their lives where testing boundaries and pushing back against the world becomes a priority. Michela, a young woman living on the outskirts of Mexico City, was in the thick of it. Her mother, a descendant of the indigenous tribes that once called the region home, was a practitioner of the old ways. She was known throughout the village as a curandera, a sort of folk healer, using the knowledge passed down to her from the generations before to ease ailments with native plants, potions, and white magic. To bolster her ancestral powers, she continued to worship the many gods and spirits of her Aztec forebears, adorning their mantle with idols and incense. Michela had grown to believe her mother was foolish for holding stock in such things. Her church-going friends often whispered and joked about her backwards mother, causing Michela no end of embarrassment. One evening, Michela's mother was reciting her evening devotions to the idols on display when she was interrupted rudely by her daughter. "Why do you insist on praying to those dolls?" asked Michela. "Everyone in the neighborhood thinks you are a fool, or worse, a witch." Her mother tried to explain the importance of their heritage, and that the community relied on the gifts granted to her by the ancient Aztec gods. How many illnesses had she healed? How many babies had she helped deliver into this world? These were not the actions of a witch or a dimwit. They were the works of divinity aided by her hands. The exasperated woman wanted very much to share her ancestral pride with Michela, but the girl was having none of it. "I think it's stupid," screamed Michela, tossing a cup toward the mantel. With a loud crash, one of the clay idols fell from its perch and shattered upon the floor. Her mother was horrified. She admonished Michela as she knelt to pick up the broken pieces, telling her that if she treated the gods that way, they would send their servant La Llorona to punish her. Michela laughed at the thought, knowing full well that La Llorona couldn't leave the maze of canals that made up Xochimilco. She left her mother weeping over the broken pottery, laughing as she went to bed. Having been asleep for hours, Michela was suddenly awakened by a bright light pouring in from her window. At first, she was frightened, the words of her mother still echoing through her dreams. Then, as the fog of sleep cleared, she realized the silvery glow was simply the light of a full moon. She laughed quietly at her mother's silly superstitions and returned her head to the pillow. Just as she was about to fade back into slumber, a chilling noise pulled her out of bed. It sounded very much like a woman's scream, half horrified, half filled with sorrow. Looking toward her window, she was shocked to see the figure of a woman coalesce within the pool of light just inside her room. When the phantom finally took shape, she knew instantly La Llorona had come for her. But how? Their home was far from the rivers and canals. Michela's mind raced, searching for an explanation. Suddenly, she remembered something her mother had told her when she was a little girl. Once every cycle, when the dim gray light is at its brightest, the ancient gods allow La Llorona to break the bonds of her watery prison, if only to do their bidding. Since the coming of the Spanish, the old ways were slowly forgotten, replaced by the teachings of black-robed priests, but that did not change the work of the gods. It only made it more difficult. No longer did devoted subjects make sacrifices to the ancient pantheon so that they would have the power to turn the sun, to grow crops, and feed the rivers with rain. In order to fuel the world of the living, they tasked La Llorona with collecting the souls that were once given willingly. In return, she was allowed this one night of freedom as long as she remained within the light of the moon. Michela leapt out of bed and began to cower in the corner of her room. La Llorona took a step closer, then another. With every passing minute, the silver beam of light from her window drew closer, paving the way for the hungry ghost. Michela desperately wished to scream, to call for her mother and chase away the evil spirit, but something stayed her voice. Cold sweat streamed across her skin as the phantom drew closer still, soft, mournful moans issuing from ghastly lips. La Llorona was but an arm's length away now, mere inches from grasping at Michela's nightgown. She cursed her childish outburst, quietly seeking forgiveness for every ill word said against her mother and her gods. Then, just as the corpse-like hand of La Llorona reached outward, the ghostly woman stopped. The light had not traveled far enough across the floor to reach her. The moon had reached its zenith, and the gods would go unsatiated. Michela wanted to jump up and down, laughing in triumph over the sequestered spirit, but she did not. Instead, in the last hours of night, she prayed to the gods of the Aztec Empire, thanking them for their work and for her life. Never again would she spurn her mother's beliefs or speak ill of the rites she fervently practiced. Stories of La Llorona, both her origins and activities, are not constrained to Mexico and the American Southwest. Stories of the Wailing Woman can be found in Guatemala and as far south as Venezuela. In the latter, La Llorona inhabits the vast llanos, or plains. She once again is the product of infanticide, though this time her family is to blame. Here the citizens hang wooden crosses on their doors, hoping the Christian symbol will ward away the evil spirit. In the former, La Llorona has a son named Juan de la Cruz. One additional detail is that if you hear her scream far away, she is actually nearby, but if the scream sounds close, there's little to worry about. Interestingly, the Chumash tribe of Southern California links La Llorona to their own story of the Nunasis, a similarly wailing predatory creature. But the connections to other mythologies don't end there. Some scholars speculate that La Llorona is simply a human archetype made manifest through the power of storytelling, one that dates back millennia. In Eastern Europe, there exists the story of Rusalka, a type of Slavic water spirit that is created when a woman is murdered or drowned and is associated with unwanted pregnancy. There is the German folktale of Die Weisse Frau, and there exists notable similarities between the Weeping Woman and the Greek myths of Lamia and parts of Jason and Medea's epic. It seems that the world over, disparate cultures have drawn connections between water, vengeful spirits, and drowned children. Many historians speculate, however, that the story of La Llorona is rooted in a deep connection to an actual historical individual, one that lies at the center of a violent transition from the old world to the new. This woman is known today as La Malinche Tenepal, which roughly translates to Doña María de la Lengua, the tongue. Her actual name was Malincine in her native Nahua language, Marina being the Spanish translation. Malinche was born sometime around the year 1500. Her early years were spent in a political province of the Aztec Empire. While many disagree on the exact name of the location, Malinche's daughter claimed the town was called Olutla, which now exists in the state of Veracruz. It seems that Malinche's family were themselves noble, or at least noble adjacent. This assertion is supported by her noted ability to speak both common Nahuatl and the completely different dialect of lordly speech relegated to the elite. Her ease with multiple languages would come to be central in her possible transformation into the spirit of La Llorona. At a young age, likely before 12, Malinche was either kidnapped by another tribe or sold into slavery. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, author of one of the earliest first-hand accounts of the Spanish conquest, titled True Story of the Conquest of New Spain, claims she was sold off by her family in order to make her half-brother a rightful heir. There is much doubt cast upon Castillo's claim, given his story is laced with Catholic allusions and references to Malinche's life as a good Christian woman. Regardless, historians agree that it is likely her family played some role in Malinche's trafficking. From there, she arrived in the port city of Xicalango and was subsequently purchased by Mayans and taken to Potonchan. It was here where Malinche learned at least 2 more dialects of Mayan, Chontal and Yucatec. It wasn't long before the Spanish would lay waste to Potonchan, and Malinche's life would once again change hands. In the aftermath of a great battle, the Mayan leaders gave the Spanish offerings of gold and 20 women, Malinche being among them. The women were divided up amongst captains, with Malinche ending up in the hands of Alonso Hernandez Puertocarrero. Eventually, the Spanish would come into contact with emissaries of the great Moctezuma at San Juan de Ulua. Here, Malinche offered to negotiate with the Aztecs using her abundant language skills. Hernan Cortez himself was taken by the girl's proficiency, offering her, quote, more than freedom at his side. The conquistador took Malinche under his wing, giving Alonso another woman in trade. From then on, Malinche served as interpreter to Cortez as well as his lover. In one account, Malinche warns the Spanish of local treachery when they arrive at Cholula. With this secret knowledge, the Spaniards were able to preemptively destroy the military force waiting in ambush. While a gripping tale, it is quite likely that this was simply a story fabricated by the Spaniards to justify Hernan's violent campaign. Malinche was also present at the siege of Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City. 1 year after the completion of the conquest, in 1522, Malinche gave birth to Cortez's firstborn son, Martin. Martin would spend little time in the presence of his natural mother, being raised as a Spaniard as opposed to Nahua. While likely not the actual first, Martin is certainly one of the first recorded mestizo in Mexico. As an early notable person of both Spanish and native blood, he is often referred to symbolically as the first true Mexican. You may have noticed that there is no mention of Cortez actually having married Malinche, something that eerily mirrors the tale of Maria and her mysterious ranchero lover. During the conquest, while Cortez was in the company of Malinche, he was actually married to a Spanish woman named Catalina Suarez Marqueda, who waited patiently for her husband in Cuba. Interestingly, Catalina died in 1522, shortly after arriving in Mexico. The official report cites asthma as her cause of death, but numerous chambermaids spoke of marks around her neck and a broken choker necklace. It seems that Catalina was also of a lower class, having origins far more humble than Cortez. There are rumors that he did away with his wife in order to find a new bride of a more suitable station. Malinche herself was passed off to a Spanish hidalgo, but would also die within a decade of the fall of Tenochtitlan. In modern-day Mexico, Malinche plays a varied role in art, legend, and national identity. Some see her as a founding figure in the story of a new nation, while others view her work alongside Cortés a dire betrayal. Her story is not only compared to La Llorona, but also the soldaderas, women who fought valiantly in the Mexican Revolution. The feminist movement of the 1960s adopted Malinche as a symbolic mother figure, while others use the term malinchismo to describe people who betray their heritage. From yet another perspective, she was a central figure in saving her own people from the tyrannical rule of the Aztec Empire, who demanded offerings and sacrifices from subjugated tribes. Still, some Mexican Catholics view her as a bringer of Christianity. While there are indeed many similarities between the tale of La Llorona and the life of Malinche, there is yet another, more ancient figure that may be central to the ghost story's origin. Deep in the annals of Aztec mythology lies a particular goddess that bears an uncanny resemblance to the wandering spirit we know today. Her name is Cihuacoatl, Snake Woman. Within the Aztec pantheon, this goddess represents the aspects of motherhood and fertility, with a special connection to midwives and the sweat baths where birthings take place. In one of her most important stories, Cihuacoatl aided Quetzalcoatl in creating the current race of man. To do this, she took the bones of previous ages and ground them into a fine powder. Then, after mixing the bone dust with fresh blood, humanity was born. It is also worth noting that Cihuacoatl had a son, Mixcoatl, whom she abandoned at a crossroads. Legend says that she occasionally returns to this place to weep for her missing son. Cihuacoatl is sometimes shown as an image of youthful beauty, but more often than not, she's a skull-faced entity bearing the weapons of a warrior. To the Aztec, the act of childbirth was not unlike that of warfare, and women in labor are said to capture the soul of their child like a warrior takes captives. As such, women who die in said conflict are honored just as true warriors are. The spirits of these deceased women are called Cihuatateo, and are said to haunt crossroads and kidnap lost or unruly children. Given the historical and mythological ties that anchor La Llorona to our reality, it seems her tale may be more than just a simple story meant to scare children and warn them from the dangers awaiting at the river's edge. Could La Llorona be a symbolic remembrance of the pain felt by indigenous people when they realized it was one of their own that had led Cortés to their gates? Or perhaps the Wailing Woman is a primeval goddess given new form, allowing her presence to be felt throughout distant ages. Despite all the speculation and evidence, there is no true answer to the origin of La Llorona. Given that similar tales of evil water spirits, vengeful ghosts, and jealous gods can be found across the globe, it seems there may be some deeper human need for understanding and explanation that gives birth to the legends of La Llorona and her ilk. Regardless, should you find yourself alone wandering the nighted riverbanks, a sorrowful wail issuing somewhere in the distance, the source of said cry is surely better left a mystery. Thank you for listening to this special Halloween episode of Mysterious West. If you are interested in further reading, click the link to the show notes in the episode description. There you will find a selection of books, resources, and articles that I used in my research. Please subscribe and leave a review if you were so inclined. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok at Mysterious West Cast. where I share all sorts of interesting facts and photos from the Old West. As I explore the various histories and cultures that play a role in the American West, I encounter numerous words and names in languages that are not my own. I have no doubt that pronunciations are wrong, and for that I apologize. This is your host, JD Wicks, reminding you to sit tall in the saddle and keep your eye on the skyline. See you at the next campfire.